And so the way that you get something to happen that isn't a short-term thing is you backward chain. You say, you point out that people will be blamed in 10 weeks, which means people will be blamed in 8 weeks, which means people will be blamed in 6 weeks, which means people will be blamed in 4 weeks, which means people will be blamed in 2 weeks, which means you're blameworthy now. So you better do something now, right?
I'm Nicholas Bartlett, co-owner of the world's first popcorn board game cafe, living in Fulton, Missouri, and you're listening to the Vance Crow Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, we interview Zvi Mowshowitz. This is a weird character. He's unusual in the way he thinks about things, but this is a rip-roaring good time. Zvi has been a Hall of Fame Magic the Gathering player. He's been a professional gambler and bookkeeper. He's traded in crypto, and he is a prolific writer, putting things out about COVID and his thoughts on the Ukraine Russia conflict. It is a really, really good conversation. We're going to go to the interview, but if you are somebody that loves reading books, you might still have time to get in one of the best books we have ever read for book club, which is The Count of Monte Cristo. If you think you can get that book read by the last Sunday of June, you should join us because we love talking about it. If you want to learn more, you can just message me on Twitter at Vance Crow. Also, as you can see, we are in the brand new studios. We are doing legacy interviews where we record the stories of your loved ones' life history. If you're interested in learning more, go to legacyinterviews.com. All right, now on to my interview with this very unusual character, Zvi. Zvi Mowshowitz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So you have a very interesting blog title called Don't Worry About the Vase. I think it's probably good just to start there. Why in the world is that what you call your blog?
Yeah, so it's from The Matrix, the scene with the Oracle, where she says, don't worry about the vase. And he says, what vase? Stumbles into the vase breaks. And Neo gets this puzzled look on his face. And she says, what's really going to cook your noodle later is, would you still have broken it if I hadn't said anything? And that always struck with me. And also because I used to be a professional Magic the Gathering player. And so when we say to break something, right, it's a very special term of art. It means to find a dominant strategy in a format of play based around a card, to prove the card is too good. Right? Not that it doesn't work, but that it works too well. And so my original column, when I started a column writing about magic, was called Don't Worry About the Vase. Because the idea was that I would give people the idea for how they might break things. And they would carry that forward. And I've enjoyed it for a while, and it's stuck, and everyone needs a name. And so I just sort of stuck with it for now something like 20 years.
You are a prolific writer, so there's all sorts of topics that we want to cover. But since you brought it up first, one of the things that I find interesting is that you are in the Hall of Fame for Magic the Gathering. For my audience, I don't know how familiar they are with this game. Can you just kind of describe it and then talk about how does one get to the Hall of Fame?
For those who don't know the game at all, it's been called a cross between chess and poker, kind of. So the idea is it's the first collectible card game, which is now a whole genre of games. So the idea is that it's sold in randomized booster packs, either physical or now digital. And you open up your packs, and then you use those packs to form your own deck of cards. And then you shuffle your deck of cards, and your opponent shuffles his deck that he built with his cards. And you each draw from your decks, and you play a game against each other. So primarily, you play lands that produce mana. Each turn, that mana is used to cast spells and to summon creatures. And then the cards do what they say they do, and eventually somebody reduces someone else's life total from 20 to 0.
And so, there's a lot of games where there's a host that actually decides how things play out. Is this one got rules and there's a clear winner and loser?
So it's basically set in a very Dungeons and Dragons-like universe, and in fact, it's had some crossover sets because it's owned by the same company that makes Dungeons and Dragons, and that was quite a lot of fun. But no, the idea here is that it was a game designed, in fact, to be played quickly without a dungeon master. Right, in that same kind of vein, it was one of the desiree of Richard Garfield who made the game. So there's a very complex set of rules for how all the cards work together. And the cards can override the rules, and you're always getting new cards, so it can be complicated. But you don't need Dungeon Master. It's a two-player game, or if you want to, you can play a multiplayer game, and each player either plays for themselves or they play on teams.
And then as people are playing these games, do you become better if you keep investing more and more money into the game so that you can have the deck of cards that you want?
So cross out the word money in that sentence and write time. right? Because it's important that you skill up, that you understand what you're doing, that you're able to think about the game. And that includes developing reactions so that when new cards come out, you can figure out what's likely to be good and bad from that. And it also means making networks of friends. But yes, you have to spend some amount of money because you have to have access to enough good cards to be able to assemble the decks that you want. But at the levels that I played, all the players always had access to all of the cards, like every time, right? So like occasionally you'd have to scramble and you'd spend the night before the tournament running around the room, trading, buying cards, trying to get the exact cards you needed. But there was never a doubt that anybody at the highest levels would always have whatever they needed because there's not an unlimited amount of money that you can spend on the game. It's a very limited amount of money. And the competitions were designed to make sure they didn't get too out of hand on top of that. So, it's always a level playing field on that level. If you're playing like at your local school, at your local game club, then if one player spends $20 and one player spends $100, the $100 player will have an advantage, but it's not an overwhelming advantage, and you can play competitively in those environments without paying much. You can also play what's called limited, where the two players each just agree to open a fixed pool of cards, and then you play from that pool, and you can even do that for weeks or months on end, and slowly add cards to the pools, or do whatever you want. And so you can create a level playing field that's fun and interesting and new on remarkably little money. So it's not a money-dominated game. Occasionally they will make money-dominated games. So like Diablo Immortal came out last week. And this is very much what's called the gotcha game. It's a game completely dominated by, if you want to get ahead, you have to spend a lot of money. But Magic was completely not like that. Still isn't.
So how does somebody get into a game so much that they get to the highest levels where there is a Hall of Fame and then you get inducted into it?
So by accident, in my case. So like a lot of players are like, I set out, I knew I was going to be a star. I set out to go to the Pro Tour. I worked really hard. I pounded the pavement. I went to all the qualifiers, and then I finally made it. And my story is not that. My story is I was in high school, and they had junior tournaments, and I played in those tournaments because that was what I was doing all day. I was doing that all the time anyway. I was just playing for fun. And in the junior tournaments, I did well. I qualified for the Junior Pro Tour, and then I spiked the Junior Pro Tour, finished second, and got a $5,000 scholarship. And then they turned out to qualify me for a Masters Tour for the adults the next year when they ended the Junior Pro Tour. And then out of about 300 people, I finished 12th in that tournament. It turned out I was actually pretty good. And then once I had that proof, right, to myself that I could be good and the right to play in a few more tournaments, then I started concentrating and focusing and trying hard at that level. And then when I was at risk of falling off, I would go to more qualifiers and I would keep myself on. But mostly just I love the game. I love playing the game. And I played a lot because I liked playing and I got good. And then over time, that shifted to a professional mindset, to a deliberate practice mindset, to I want to win at the highest levels. I need to train. I need to practice. I need to experiment. I need to form a team. I need to figure this out.
And when you think about like playing a game and then getting to the professional level, what is it about the game that you understand that people that are just playing for fun or, as amateurs don't know?
So there's a lot of different levels to it. When you see real amateurs play, they're just not thinking very strategically. They're not asking themselves, like, what are the paths to victory? What are the things that would be most efficient to do? How would you arrange things? How do you make my deck reliable? How do I plan ahead? What's likely to be in their hand? What are they thinking based on what they're doing? Thinking 4 moves, 10 moves, 30 moves ahead to the entire end of the game. Trying to solve all these different problems. They don't have experience building decks at the higher levels. And drafting, especially playing limited, is even more complex. But it's something. To me, it's like an attitude of deliberate practice of treating it as a skill to develop, which is something I didn't do my first few years of playing, when there wasn't really a professional tour, and I wasn't thinking of it that way. But I was always the kind of person who's very competitive. I was always thinking like, okay, how do I make this better? How do I make this work? But it wasn't systematic. But like, it's also a continuum. Like there are players who have never been on the Pro Tour who could make it on the Pro Tour if they just gave it a shot. And there are other players on the Pro Tour who like aren't very good or just got really lucky. They went to a tournament for fun, and that day, like the cards just loved them. Right? They just got really lucky. They picked the right deck. They were sitting in the right seat for the draft. They did really well. Now they're on the Pro Tour, and maybe they kept going from there. But there isn't like a professional. It's not like baseball, right? Where there's like, okay, these professionals will every time just crush everybody who isn't a professional. It's embarrassing. And then in basketball, where it's like, okay, one professional and 4 teenagers or even 10-year-olds up against like 5 reasonably good adults on the regular court, and the one guy just wins, he's passing the ball all the time, right? Like it's not like that at all.
So what I saw as a connection between what you were doing and kind of the rest of the world was your conversation about how game theory applies to things like Magic the Gathering. For people that have no concept of game theory, what is it and how does it apply?
So game theory is this idea that if you can formalize, okay, what are the moves that this person can make in this interaction, and what are the moves that this person could make in response or simultaneously to this action, how much utility or how big a score, how much benefit do they get out of that, positive or negative? And then you try to figure out, okay, given the series of possible actions and the possible outcomes, and know that other people are going to also know this and think ahead. Like, what's the right move? What should I do to get the best possible outcome? And what does that imply about what other people are going to do? And so on, including in iterated games where you play more than one round, including in games with more than 2 players. And this can go anywhere from, like, the traditional example is the prisoner's dilemma, where the 2 of us are questioned by the police. If either of us, rats out the other guy, we get off scot-free. But if we both rat out the other guy, it's worse than if we had both stood firm, then we'd both be okay. And so that game is very hard to win when it's only done once. And so you have to try and introduce additional elements of various types or develop a very good decision theory and relationship to the other player so that you can possibly win. All the way up to like games like nuclear war, right? Like where you don't want to make moves that result in a huge disaster. And so the question is like, well, if I did this, how would they have to react based on the situation? How are you going to make a miscalculation? And then it gets really, really complicated. But game theory is at the core of a lot of the things that you do in a game like Magic, because you are trying to anticipate several moves ahead of what other people might do, and then figure out how to get yourself the best possible result. But game theory is also, both competitively and cooperatively, a large part of how I think the proper model of the world is in general.
Oh, this is interesting because as I'm sitting here, so I studied game theory when I was in diplomacy school, and I found it to be a gratingly overly simplified way of looking at the world, because it's not, do we go to nuclear war or do we not go to nuclear war? There are an infinite number of choices that you could make and how you can play out the game. And I always found that the representations that reviewed game theory often oversimplified what options were available.
God, yes. I mean, have you ever played the game diplomacy? Because I've played a decent amount of diplomacy, even if I haven't gone to diplomacy school.
It's probably very similar. I don't know that diplomacy school was any more valuable.
Playing diplomacy it'll teach you a lot. Several presidents have played it. It's a dangerous game. It ruins friendships, but it's very educational. So I would say you're absolutely right that if you read an academic paper and they include game theory on a situation, it is almost always going to be horribly simplified and really bad, right? And they're going to basically just sort of prove some sort of very simple relationship that like you didn't need the game theory to prove, while leaving out a bunch of stuff and then draw an overly broad conclusion. This is the most frustrating when I read like papers on AI safety and general we could cooperate and do something safe, or we could defect and do something dangerous. And what does this imply based on game theory? It's like, just go away. Like you're wasting my time. But like that's, the real use of game theory is much more complex. It has much more levels to what's going on, especially when we're talking about what AIs might do against each other, which I don't want to get too much in the weeds because it's got too much necessary background that like just the readers would just not, the listeners just won't have. But the idea being, well, if I'm an AI that can anticipate what this other AI is going to do, and they can read my source code and I can read their source code, now the game theory gets really complicated and interesting. But I would say basically the failure of game theory to appeal to you is because it's being basically kind of botched and mishandled by the people who you've encountered it with.
Well, I mean, I would say I was using it at a pretty high level, but I think about things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? There was no model that somebody could have said, maybe what Kennedy will do is he will call up the Turkish government and get them to be a part of this. Because the real world has an infinite number of options to it. And the biggest challenge of game theory is that you have to, have your little prisoner's dilemma Punnett square where it's like, defect, not defect, do they defect or not defect? And this is how many, but the possibilities seem infinite. So there are very few situations in the real world that I think play out in the way that game theory would predict, and yet we keep using it to be a forward model.
I mean, for the Cuban Missile Crisis in particular, I feel like it's actually a situation in which like reasonably straightforward game theory is actually pretty good, in the sense that you can model the Cuban Missile Crisis as probabilistic chicken, effectively, right, with the possibility of negotiated settlement. And you don't need to know specifically about Turkey to know that, like, you know, the two sides can reach an agreement whereby, you know, the Americans get what they want and they agree to something else. You can have different degrees of visible results versus invisible results, again, without knowing directly about Turkey. So I think if you had a more complex version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you abstracted various moves to some extent, and like at various points in the crisis, based on the situation, there was like a probabilistic escalation, something very bad, then you could model it as, well, you know, Kennedy chose to take some risk of nuclear war in order to some combination of get leverage in the situation and communicate to the other side that he was willing to make moves that risked nuclear war, which is also valuable in the context of playing this type of game. Right? You reveal something about yourself. And also you commit yourself to going down a road whereby Kennedy didn't really have an out. Right? If Khrushchev didn't withdraw the missiles in some way, didn't find a way to get them withdrawn, Kennedy made it what's called burning the bridge behind him. Right? He made it very, very difficult for him to back down. That's another classic game theory move. So like the Cuban Missile Crisis is full of game theory moves. Right? A blockade.
I like this. I like the way you think about this. This is very good.
Right, and so like I'm not necessarily full of praise for how anyone handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think it was like a huge unnecessary risk of nuclear war compared to many alternatives. And you could also think of it as an iterated game, right? Like how do you act in Berlin, thinking about the possibility of Cuba, right? So it goes all the way. And I think this is kind of like Howard Cohen talks about cracking cultural codes, right? And this is one of my cultural codes that I feel like I have a strong handle on, and I like to use it in a lot of situations.
So let's talk more about that. When you say cracking the cultural code, what do you mean?
So what I mean is that like there's a lot of whenever I see, when you see people working in different professions, they know a different set of things, and they use a different set of terminology, and they relate to them in a different type of way. And these different types of ways of relating to the world like are better and worse at solving different problems. And the more than you have, the more perspectives you have, the more you can combine them and shift between them. The more you can understand what other people are doing and how they're working, and also you can choose the right tool or combination of tools for the right job. So I think a lot of the advantage that I have is that I have a relatively unique and broad set of these types of tools. Like not as broad as Tyler's, maybe somewhat deeper in some places. Like I have like the gamblers and traders tools, I have the standard economist tools, I have a set of mathematical, game theoretical tools, I have the gamers tools, and I now have them as a writer. The one thing I'm missing that I miss the most is I don't have a foreign language. I have a learning disability, and I unfortunately was unable to do that. But that's another example of like if you can think in another language, right? It's not just English anymore. Now it's English and French, or English and Hebrew, or ideally English, Chinese, and Russian, and Hindi, and like all that other.
Yeah, I think the biggest benefit of learning a different language, at least for me, was there are certain constructions of the English language that just funnel your thinking down one path, and you don't even realize how much of your language is actually your culture reflected in the way that you think. And so, like, I had the chance to learn Swahili, and all of a sudden you realize, like, the way that they construct concepts like feeling sorry for someone, like there's somebody's going through a sad time, and spending time with them are concepts that are one and the same, but we don't really have that similar concept. It's almost impossible to explain in the English language, but you realize like how much of what you think is just all around you. But I see your point about being able to see other cultural contexts through your experience. How did you get all of these different things?
I did
Trading,
mainly.
I
started out. I was in school, and then I suddenly was playing games, and I was playing games professionally, and then I was gambling, and then I was bookmaking, and then I was trading, and I was also a startup founder, so I got the chance to try and found a few companies, and then I was a game designer, and the whole time I was a blogger and a writer. And you go one by one, and you just also have just taken a natural interest in a lot of these things. And so the more different perspectives you can get, and I try to read a variety of things and look at a variety of perspectives, and I try to model everything I can. But yeah, and I'm involved in the rationalist community, which is its own additional set of stuff. Like if you talk, you go to a rationalist meetup, it's interoperable. Like it's English, you can understand most of it, and like it's a similar. But in many ways, it is a different dialect, right? You talk to people, and they have this other set of concepts, this other way of relating to things. They have all of this jargon, and it's not so much the words as the way of using them and the way they connect to each other, and the concepts are just again a different way. And it's not as different as Swahili might be to English, but it serves a similar purpose.
So let's talk about your experience in gambling. That's one that I think most people can relate to on some level, right? They've been around, they've been able to make bets. But when you open up the hood, it's got to be a little bit different than just like with the Magic the Gathering, the amateurs play a different game than the pros.
Very much so. I have a hard time relating to the game that the amateurs play. It never appeals to me in the same way. It's interesting because a lot of professionals are the opposite, right? Like Billy Walters says, like in interviews, one of the most famous gamblers of all time, he had to be good at gambling, otherwise he'd lose all his money gambling. And it's a lot of them. A lot of them, like I found out as a bookmaker, they have giant leaks in their game. They will constantly be gambling. If they're not gambling to win, they'll gamble to lose, right? Like regardless of what they think of it as. And so it's their defense. It's their way of both getting gambling money and making sure they don't waste the gambling money. I wasn't like that. I was always terrified of gambling, but then I discovered an opportunity. And so I was always an advantage better, meaning I would only bet when I thought I had an edge. And so my betting was on mainly, I did some poker. That was mainly kind of a pay the bills, grind it out type of thing. Like I enjoyed it and then it got boring pretty quickly, but it was still like a very clearly easy way to like go to the Indian casino. I was at a startup and I wasn't earning a paycheck. And I'd grind out on the weekend, or go in the afternoon after I was done with work, and I'd make enough money to pay the rent on my studio apartment because I was young and starting out. But I really got going with sports betting. So in sports betting, I used a variety of techniques, but the main thing I did was I understood the math and the statistics behind it really well, especially the way that different odds related to each other. So like one of the things, like in a baseball game, if I know how often the home team wins the game, and I know how often there are more than 8.5 runs scored in this game, how does that translate to the chance that the home team wins by at least 1.5 runs, right? By 2 or more runs? How does that relate to whether they score 5 or more runs during the course of the game, right? Other questions like that. And so the specialty we would have is we would, me and my partner at this, is that I would create very, very clear systems for figuring out questions like that and more sophisticated questions that were harder to answer, including questions like if the score is this at halftime of a football game, which are the odds for the second half for a basketball game, or even during a live game, or if the game last week had these odds, the game for these two teams had these odds, and you combine all of them together, what does that imply next week's game should look like? Right? You can create complicated math equations that tell you, okay, this is what the gambling odds imply is how good each of these teams is, and then how good these pitchers are. And then what does that mean about the next game with this pitcher against this pitcher in this field, right? And this pitcher's left-handed, and we know this thing about this team, this thing about this team, and then eventually you write a program, you handicap it, and you figure out what the real odds are, or what the odds should be in some sense. And then you look at the odds of the market, and you ask, what does the market know that I don't know? Do I have an opportunity here? And then you try to bet at the right times. And I also specialized in what's called steam chasing. And that's where you have a variety of different markets. It's like you have like these 10 books. The world has hundreds of books that'll each take your bet. And they don't have the same line, the same gambling odds. They have their own unique gambling odds. So what you can do is you can use the consensus of different gambling odds and exactly how they move to form a feeling of where the line is going to be in the future and what the fair odds actually are. Wait for somebody to make a mistake somewhere. Combine this with the ability to translate the math between different odds that are actually the same thing, but in different ways. Find the odds that are mispriced. And without even knowing who the teams are, find a good bet.
So if you can figure out how to beat the bookmaking or the book, why do
I don't do it now.
I mean, this would seem
so
like
one reason is it gets harder every year. So I was doing it. I talked to somebody who joined a friend of mine who turned out to have started it several years before me, and he told me stories about how easy it was for him. That it was just like my jaw was on the floor. I was like, I can't believe they let you do that. And even so, I found giant gaping holes. You look now, the holes are not as big. there's still opportunity. I could definitely still win. But so the reason I stopped initially was because I got a chance to be on the other side of it, right? I got a chance to book the bets. And by booking the bets, you get to have a lot more leverage. You get to play for as the house, which means, instead of paying the juice, you get the juice, which is always good. And you get more information because you see all the bets coming in. And then you get to use your intelligence to play on a much bigger scale because you're doing what's called other people's money, right? And also, like, you just have a lot more. So that matched my skill set even more. Right? I used all the information. I synthesized all of what I knew to figure out what was happening. And then I played a strategy game against the gamblers out there, right? And I tried to get the best possible outcome. And that was great. And then, but after I left, I said, you know what? I could try this again, but there's two problems. One of which is, at the time I was a little bit liquidity constrained. I didn't have the ability to have that big a bankroll. I just had a new son who'd come out of the world. And like my equities from various things hadn't matured yet, and so on. So I didn't have the ability to put a large amount of money at risk like I did before. And one mistake a lot of gamblers make is they'll be like, I have this $10,000, and so to make sure to bet only 1% of my bankroll so I never go bankrupt. But they forget they have rent. And so like if you don't make enough money to get out from the rent trap and the food trap, where you have expenses, then you never win. Because a lot of these gamblers, what they do is they win. Right? They go 55% for the season, and they do really, really well after working really, really hard. Because they didn't bet enough, they didn't actually come out that far ahead after paying their expenses. And so eventually they had a bad year and they're dead. So like one of the things that we did right, me and my partner, was we're going to bet reasonably big while we have a small bankroll compared to the size of our bankroll. And if we lose, well, either we got unlucky or more likely we just weren't that good at this. And when we get bigger, we act more responsibly. And so slowly as we got bigger, we acted more and more responsibly. But much better to have other people's money and you can just act really, really responsibly and also like bet lots of money and have the advantage. So, but after I left, I said, you know what? I don't want my life to be about this. I don't want to be thinking about sports every day. I don't want to be asking the same questions every day. I want to move on to something else that's more interesting. And if I don't move on, I'm never going to be in another mode, right? I want to be, and also like my wife can't relate to sports betting, right? Just not something she's interested in. And I actually really value being able to talk about what I've done at the end of the day, right? It's actually a really important thing in life. I don't really want my kids to like just see a guy who's betting on sports all day for the next 20 years. It's like, who needs that? So instead, I get a job at Game Street Capital, right? After my startup didn't work out, and I traded on a trading desk, and I traded stocks and ETFs and futures and so on. I did that for 2.5 years. And then I realized that wasn't a great fit either. And then I traded crypto briefly. And again, I had a decision, okay, I can make money trading crypto. There's no question I can make money trading crypto. But if I do this, my head's just going to be in crypto mode every day, all the time. I cannot do this. And so I said, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to build something. And so I decided to build a game. And I decided to keep blogging. And so that's where I am right now.
Let's go back. Like, it's interesting that you have the foresight to be able to say, oh, like, I don't want my children to watch their dad be a sports betting guy for all these years. Do you find that you are like totally engrossed in whatever it is that you're doing? I mean, it sounds like they becomes consuming because of how much intellectual horsepower you'd have to put behind in order to win.
I'm very much a competitor, a game player, a strategist, an analyst. That's what I enjoy, is solving problems, solving puzzles, optimizing systems. So I'm definitely going to be all out in whatever it is that I'm looking to do. If it's a combination of things, I'm going to be switching modes between them, but I'm definitely going to be all out. But yeah, it's so like when you're doing something like trading or gambling, it's very, very important that you give it your all and be really dialed in, because marginal improvements in your game are a huge difference, right? Like the difference between like just sort of being there and okay, I think I have a vague idea what I should be doing, and really being dialed in and noticing every little thing is huge. And so like when you're really dialed in, something happens, you can just instantly know what to do, and you get a much better price than if you had to take a minute to figure it out. What
do you think is the difference or similarity between gambling and trading stocks?
Trading stocks is harder. Like so gambling is more expensive in the sense that like if you just do things at random, you'll lose money a lot faster. So like if you can trade stocks as an amateur and still win, right? If you just go buy the S&P 500 or just throw darts at a board and just buy stuff. But as long as you're not constantly buying and selling, you're going to be okay. But gambling, like, no, you have to be good or you lose, right? There's no baseline alpha until you find it. But your opposition in gambling is much, much weaker. So gambling is a combination of all of the really smart guys who really know how to do this and figured out there are bigger ponds to play in. Right? They move on to trading bigger things where they can make more money, a lot of them. But also, like, there's just so many amateurs who are in it not to make money, but to have fun, and just aren't very good at this, or some combination thereof. So there's always going to be a balance between what the price should be, in some sense, like what the fair price is, and what the sort of naive price is for, like, just a guy who's watching ESPN. And so, even if you're not particularly good, you can always use that difference to get ahead, right? So, like, one of the things I like to say is if you just want to make money in sports, one of the easiest ways to do it is you find a sports bar where everybody is an NBA fan on a day in the life of the NBA. And you walk in, you take the lines out, right, the odds. You show them to the old guys having a drink at the bar, right? You say, who do you like? And you hear their opinions. And if everybody likes the same team, and it's not the home team in the town you have the bar, you bet against that team. And if you did that reliably, right? I mean, if they have a pattern and everybody involved just happens to like the Milwaukee Bucks, and like you're in Denver, doesn't mean that you should bet against Milwaukee every day. But if the line seems too good to be true on a side, and everybody who doesn't know what they're doing wants to bet on it, it means that's the wrong side. You want to be on the other side. And so if you do that, and you combine it with like getting reasonably good odds, you're all set. That's one of the big differences. Is in the stock market, there's one price, right? If I want to buy Apple stock, there's one price. I can try to like give an exact order to try and get a few extra pennies out of it, but like I'm going to pay whatever I'm going to pay. Whereas if I go to bet on the Washington Nationals tonight, there's 100 different books, and making sure I get the right price on that proposition is a lot of what determines whether I'm going to be a winner or a loser in the long run.
When you were studying stocks, what information did you take in that you thought like gave you the edge in the game?
I was trading on behalf of the trading desk at Jane Street, so we were all in it together. So it wasn't that I was doing individual things, and I would occasionally find a strategy that like I found that I said, okay, I think we should do this. But mostly I executed the strategies that we had developed over the years at the desk. And I don't want to get into them because they're still doing them at the firm and it wouldn't be fair. But the basic answer is that we learned to think about how things related to each other and how the patterns in the markets repeated themselves. And we learned how to do studies of various types to find out whether things were predictable and repeatable. And also, like, we learned the best way to execute various things. So, like, we learned, okay, so if I was on the international ETF desk, so we were trading various countries, and one of the countries I had was Poland, for example. So the question of, like, if for whatever reason, the people who were trading the international ETFs were selling a lot of the emerging market ETFs in general, that would mean we'd be short Poland, right? We'd be selling a lot of Polish stocks. So I would be tasked potentially with, okay, you need to find a way to buy a bunch of Poland, right? And there's a few different ways you can buy Polish stocks or get long Poland so that we don't have this liability in case these people know something or they just happen to be right. And so it'd be my job to figure out what's the cheapest way to express that and to hedge our risk.
This is so interesting to hear you describe it this way because in my time in corporate America, when I would meet with investor relations people, whether it was the company I was working for or other companies, it struck me that, one, there's no way they could possibly compile the information about these giant companies. You're talking about a company that's generating billions of dollars worth of revenue, and they're writing them down so that they can go into booklets and be sent off. And it just struck me that it seemed like the information the companies provided about themselves was virtually worthless, but I could be totally wrong.
Right? They have to provide true information, and you know that it's reliable, so you can use that, but you can't rely on it by itself blind without thinking about it. So one thing you can do is you can figure out, okay, this is what they're telling me. Their goal is to have their stock price be as high as possible when they give me this information, right? If they could have given me better information that would have looked better to me, they would have given me that instead. But instead, they're giving me the best possible information as the law tells them they're allowed to give. So based on that, how do I interpret the information that they're actually giving me? What does it tell me, right? And that tells you a lot.
Well, so that leads into an excellent section that you know a lot about, but has kind of fallen out of favor for what people talk about, which is COVID. You know, you give regular updates about what the numbers are and how it looks in the world and what's going on. And so what is your motivation for doing that? And why is what you're providing different than what people see when they look at Twitter and there's COVID numbers
So
or they
that's
check out their
changed
local news?
a bunch over the course of the 2 years that I've done it. So when I first did it, I first wrote a post about COVID just because I was like, wow, I see this is about to happen. I want to warn my friends and anybody else who's listening to get ready, take preparations before everyone else is taking preparations, and it gets to be a madhouse. Right? That's better for everyone. If you make all the preparations while things aren't crazy, then you're not making things worse, you're making things better. Because now when everyone else is scrambling, you're already prepared. And I also wanted my friends to be okay, so I wrote about that. And then after that, I was thinking to myself, okay, I need to work through this. I need to figure out what's going on. How should I think about my risks? How should I think about my future? When am I going to go back to the city? Because I'd moved with my family out to a town called Warwick, New York, in order to have a yard and enough space so that we didn't go crazy, basically, during the pandemic. Because we could have locked down. I was prepared to lock down, and then my wife, like 2 weeks before things were about to happen, said, "Oh my God, we'll go crazy in this apartment." I was like, "Oh yeah, you're right." So we moved. But I was trying to figure it out for myself. What's going on? What's likely to happen? For many reasons. And the best way I know to figure things out is to write. Right? Like at first I was writing essentially for myself. I was saying, I'm writing this, and like if you read it and you get value out of it, that's great. I want you to do that. And I want you to give me your responses to that, how you feel about that. But the most important thing is that I need to write this for my own sanity, because I'm doom scrolling through Twitter like everybody else. I am updating all of the news websites. I am looking at this stuff. And I want to analyze it anyway, and writing potentially for an audience, but mainly for myself. And then after a while, it was clear that people were relying on this, and like I was allowing people to not go crazy themselves doom scrolling Twitter and worrying about this, because they could just rely on me to a large extent to know that if something really big happened, that I would pick up on it. And so that made me feel a lot better about putting in the work, and it made me feel a lot better like about my ability to execute and do the work. And I think the difference between what I was doing and what other people else were doing was I was actually trying to model what was happening and figure out like the underlying mechanisms, the gears in the physical world. And then ask, okay, so what's going to happen next? Why did these things happen? What might we do both individually and as a society to try and mitigate the situation and do the best we can? And how you build up a model of how this has happened and what has happened, which might apply to things beyond COVID. And so I made predictions week to week, and I said how I thought things were playing out and why they were playing out and what was likely to happen. I evaluated scientific data, and over time you get better and better at these things. You work out routines, you figure out good sources from bad sources, and after a while, at some point, and once the vaccine came, I was okay, it's winding down, but there were so many people relying on me at that point. I said, okay, it's public service. I have thousands of people who are counting on this to not have to worry about it themselves, and nobody else is doing anything like this on basically any subject. And so it's in demand. I should try and keep this up. It's not useless for me. I'm still going to be doing some amount of this scrolling myself anyway, and it helps me concentrate my thoughts. And it's definitely been a very good investment, both in terms of helping other people, but also I had so many opportunities come to me because people say, I read your COVID pieces. And I love your ability to analyze things, and let's talk. Let's talk about something else. Or what do you think about this? And that's been great.
So what is your analysis about COVID revealed that you think most people haven't realized yet?
So I think that a lot of the things that I realized earlier have now been realized, right, by many people. But the main thing is sort of what are our systems optimizing for, right? What do our systems care about? What are they trying to do? And so I like to say that people in power and politics, in the medical ethics fields, in the public health, they are primarily optimizing for blame avoidance on a 2-week time horizon. It's one of my biggest principles.
Say that again. They're optimizing for blame avoidance in short term.
It's an estimate, but it seems about right. And so the idea being, if they can see forward to 2 weeks from now, they're going to get blamed for something. They want no part of that. And if they see something they won't be blamed for 2 weeks from now, okay, right? That's not the entire thing that's going on. That's a lot of it. And so the way that you get something to happen that isn't a short-term thing is you backward chain. You say, you point out that people will be blamed in 10 weeks, which means people will be blamed in 8 weeks, which means people will be blamed in 6 weeks, which means people will be blamed in 4 weeks, which means people will be blamed in 2 weeks, which means you're blameworthy now. So you better do something now, right? And so you can sometimes construct this pathway, and that can be a theory of change, can get something to happen. And it's very, very hard to do without this happening. The other thing is that you have to realize that like a lot of our COVID prevention and COVID action has nothing to do with preventing COVID. And never did, right? That it was about what I call sacrifices to the gods. So it's the idea of the way that you are not blameworthy, the way that you have done your job against COVID, the way that you are a good person is that you sacrifice. And the way that you make sure that the society is good is you make the society sacrifice. You destroy something, right? You burn the sacrificial lamb at the altar. And that shows your piety. And like, it's important, you always have to differentiate, when are we sacrificing to the gods? And when are we doing something that's physically real, right? Like, when are we just doing the symbolic thing versus we're doing the real thing? And over time, it became clear that more and more of it was both always symbolic and becoming symbolic, as opposed to being real. And people weren't interested in the real very much. In particular, when the real didn't involve sacrifice, people weren't interested. Like, this is my theory of Paxlovid, right? The problem with Paxlovid is there aren't any side effects. And it doesn't have any downsides. It just cures COVID. But if it just cures COVID, then what's even the point? There's a sense in which, like, okay, I don't care.
What did we give all this up for?
Suddenly you
Why
realize
did we do
this
all
person is
this?
32 years old and a 99.9 something % chance of being perfectly okay. And they say, oh, you don't need it. Well, then why was I being told to uproot my life and not get it this entire time, right? And the answer is because then it was a moral issue, right? It was about like being responsible and doing the right thing and worrying about the impact on the broader society. And the idea of controlling the pandemic so everyone didn't get it at once was obviously very real. And of course, before the vaccine, the COVID was a lot more dangerous. Before Omicron, COVID was a lot more dangerous. But there's a real sense in which, you know, the concern was never really about what it was supposed to be about to a large extent. And simultaneously, the people who were against all these restrictions were also just symbolically against the restrictions to a large extent. Right? That they were against, because you know, these people say we should do these things because it's symbolically the right thing. And other people are like, this is symbolically the wrong thing. And they didn't stop to think whether or not it was worth it on the merits either, for the most part. Right? Some people did on both sides.
Yeah, that's interesting because once it becomes a symbol, then all you're doing is fighting over whether your symbols are the right symbols or my symbols are the right symbols, as opposed to, you know,
right.
what is this leading us towards?
You know, I've got my mask and you've got your no mask. And neither of us is doing it for the right reason necessarily. Right? Like some people actually did a calculation. Like there was a period where it's like, okay, if you think symbolically you're supposed to not wear a mask, you don't wear a mask. Symbolically, you think you're supposed to wear a mask, you're wearing a cloth mask. If you're actually trying to prevent COVID, you're wearing an N95. Like this was a period in 2020. Or the people who understood they actually were trying to prevent COVID had moved on to N95s. Right? And like doctors were wearing N95s. But the people who didn't know were just like playing a symbolic game where either they felt like it was important to do prevention and they wore a cloth mask, they didn't do very much. Or they thought it was important to not do prevention, to not let the man keep you down, and they were explicitly, you know, trying not to wear masks.
I mean, we could stay in the COVID area, but I'm actually very intensely interested in another subject right now, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it. I didn't know I was going to ask you about this, but inflation seems to be something that everybody, you know, 3 months ago said, no, it's transitory. No, it's not going to be that bad. Nobody has a crystal ball.
Your Twitter feed is not my Twitter feed.
Excuse me?
3 months ago, everyone I was watching, like, they knew. Like, maybe not the full extent of the, you know, it's definitely been a rocky 3 months in terms of actual news. Right? But certainly after the Russia invaded Ukraine, like, nobody in my feeds that I pay attention to was thinking that it wasn't going to be big inflation problem.
Fair enough. The timeline might not be right on that. Like I would say, I'm in the business community. So whether I'm sitting on a board or I'm consulting, the business community did not want to face a reality about inflation. So there was definitely this like, we don't know that. It's not necessarily going to happen. Let's not make those choices. But in any case, now I think people looking in Missouri, if gas is at $4.90, which wherever you're at might be a lot higher than that, but it is a big deal here. Where is inflation going, and how will people react in predictable ways?
So, I am on team both, right? Like I was never on team transitory fully, but I'm also not in like team it's all because we printed a bunch of money and now it's a horrible wage price spiral or anything. So I'm somewhere in the middle. Like there's definitely been my model is supply chain has been a huge deal, disruptions have been a huge deal. COVID, like actually causing real problems, has been a huge deal, right? Too much money chasing too few goods is, of course, a lot of the core of this, right? We gave people a bunch of money, we expanded the money supply, but we're not producing as much in many ways because people have done less work for a while, because in some ways we're less productive, because we've got these disruptions to global supply. These are real. Everybody wanted to shift from services into goods at the same time, right? And so you don't save that much money on services because people aren't going to work for that much less money just because people don't want services, but the goods shoot through the roof. And so, that's going to be a continuing problem. But also the Fed was just way too slow to act, right? Like we don't have a GDP level targeting regime. We don't look at predicted future inflation or predicted future GDP and react to it. The Fed just sort of like Powell tries to figure it out and then says, okay, this is what I'm going to do based on my anticipations. And also, they kind of had a loose commitment to a level target, a sort of targeting regime where they were going to keep things loose for a while, but they didn't really mean it. And that's the worst of both worlds, right? If you're going to do that kind of thing, you got to stick to your guns. But predictably, they weren't going to stick to their guns the way they had in mind. They're going to bend in various ways, and that's something the market did a reasonable job of understanding wasn't real in some ways, and that was a problem. But fundamentally speaking, I think a lot of people, just fooled themselves. They're like, well, all these prices are going up, but look at core inflation. But also due to these disruptions. But come on, you can't count lumber going up 200% or whatever it was, or like used cars going up like another 200%. That's going to come down. That's not real. But a lot of things that up. We didn't used to read about a new shortage every week. This is new. This is a serious set of problems. And like, what's going to happen predictably? Well, first of all, people are going to blame whoever's in charge. Right? That's the first thing they're going to do. And if things aren't going to get better in the next few months, then November is quite possibly going to be a bloodbath. Because they're going to look at the people in charge. They're going to say, well, Biden, you had both houses. This happened to you. We don't really have a model as to why it happened exactly. But we know that it costs a lot to fill up our gas tank. We know that it costs a lot to buy a place to live. We know it costs a lot to put food on the table. And this is unacceptable. So, let's try something else. Right? Like, we don't know why you failed, but you failed us. And, that's kind of how democracy works a lot of the times. Is, you're counting on throwing the bums out when things aren't good, much more so than you're counting on these people to know why things aren't good or what could have been done instead. That's the first thing that's going to happen. The second thing is people are going to call for very counterproductive solutions, and we're going to see if people do really, really stupid stuff. Right? So we're talking about windfall taxes and price controls and price gouging concerns and, all these other types of things that people do when they say, oh, the market's broken, we need to break the market. And so, it's going to be very important to see how much of that, we end up doing, hopefully almost none or even none of it, but it's definitely something to worry about. And then the other question is, will we in fact do the things that would be useful in the situation? Like, there are still whispers, but there are whispers we might do something with the Jones Act. Right? Like, that's the very embodiment of an obviously correct thing to do. Right now, you can't take your spices in one port in America and ship them to another port. It's not allowed. Right? You could do it on an American ship, an American crew, built in America, owned in America, flagged in America, but there's basically no risk left. No,
but almost no ships are flagged in America. It's too expensive. They try and avoid their taxes.
So, obviously it would be a great load off our backs to get rid of this stupid rule. And there's a number of other similar stupid rules, a bunch of tariffs, a bunch of trade restrictions, get ourselves off the ground, put a significant dent in the problem. We could do a number of other things that would be helpful, but that goes against the nature of politicians these days, right? The American public, one theory I've been subscribing to lately is that the American public, in some ways, has a much closer eye than it used to on what politicians are doing. And so, American people have always been against trade on some fundamental level. They've been very suspicious of trade, and especially foreign trade. And so we've lost our ability to not demagogue on it in some important sense. And this is leading to much worse sets of rules and much worse outcomes in ways that are directly affecting inflation. And that could be a few points, which is a big deal. But keep in mind also, inflation is high in Europe too, right? It's high all over because everyone's got too much money chasing too few goods, fundamentally speaking, even if you didn't overspend. And also we just spent so much money, right? And so that's a one-time shock. If we don't keep doing it, that will calm things back down. So my guess is the market is not being crazy when it predicts inflation is going to go down. This is, it's probably peaking now-ish, is my guess. And it's not going to keep doing 10% a year for years. It's not going to go just up and up and up and up. We're not going to lose everything. It's not going to be a huge disaster like the 70s. But it's going to be a while before we get to, right? And if we want to, we have to work a lot harder than we're working.
Yeah, it strikes me that as you see things like diesel prices going just the highest that they've ever been when we're getting it out of the East Coast, that people don't really have a sense. If you've never really seen how agriculture works, how our transportation systems work, just how much the increase in those prices impact every other thing. So even if the inflation doesn't stay at 8%, the prices I believe are maybe not. I feel like they're likely permanent, but if not permanent, definitely longer lasting
that's an optimistic story,
the next
right?
couple of years.
Because if your story is the problem is there isn't enough diesel, there isn't enough gasoline, and these prices are going through, because the price of oil is effectively going through to everything else, then the price of oil goes up, but it can come down, and it probably will eventually, almost certainly come down. If you look at the futures trading, right? It's expected to slowly come down on average over time. And one of the policies I support is that when we're selling oil from the Strategic Oil Reserve, we should be buying that oil back, but 5 years out, right? Some huge amount of time out to raise the price of the futures to encourage production and also to insure the United States against a rise in prices because we all bought the oil now, right? So it's doubly useful. And if we end up losing money on this horrible trade, oh no, whatever shall we do? But be happy, right? It's very low risk. We can also expand the size of the reserve so we could buy a lot more, and then maybe we don't even take delivery, right? We just sell it back because we don't necessarily need it anymore, depending on what the situation is, or we need it in the market more than we need it. We buy more futures. And we have all these different things we can do. But, in commodities, the only cure for high prices is high prices, right? So we're building electric cars literally as fast as we can get our hands on lithium. And we're not opening up but we're not drilling for new oil. So the prices in some sense aren't high enough. Right? A combination of the administration isn't that interested in doing what it takes to get oil and gas production going, and there's no expectation that prices will remain high for long enough. But if you talk about 5 years from now, if the prices have been $150, $200 a barrel for real money terms for 5 years, I have to assume there's plenty of capacity we brought online, and all we have to do is be willing to guarantee purchases basically at some reasonable level to justify production. There's plenty of spare capacity. And over time, we're going to get more energy efficient. And over time, we're going to transition to electric. And also, we're seeing a push for nuclear power throughout the world now, right? We're seeing Europeans turn their nuclear plants back on. We're seeing South Korea build more nuclear plants. We're seeing India commit to nuclear plants. Even Japan is thinking about more nuclear plants. So, over time, we're going to transition. Solar is going to be a bigger portion of everyone's energy. Wind is going to be a bigger portion of everyone's energy. And there's a lot of knobs we haven't turned, right? We haven't even waived the Jones Act. Literally, we're putting diesel into trucks to drive things from port to port over land during a gas shortage, when there are plenty of ships that can do this on tiny fractions of the amount. And we just say the word. We take substantial pressure off of the market and off of the traffic. We just don't do it. So I would say it's a very optimistic story to me even though that's counterintuitive in some ways, because it's a solvable problem, and a problem that probably will be solved, which is if we have an energy crisis. Well, they pass in some important sense. And we had to solve it anyway, right? We couldn't be burning all this diesel forever because of climate change.
Well, you are more optimistic than I expected. I was imagining, well, I mean, just because from my own view, at least, which is probably like a shorter time horizon than the one you're talking about, to me, that the amount of pressure that we've seen on regular people's lives is not anywhere near where it could get. But, you know, like Coinbase today, for example, laid off 1,100 workers. And my sense is there's a lot of corporations that are going to be hurting because the amount of the cost of goods sold is a lot higher than it was before.
Like, we had Bitcoin 22,000 instead of 65,000.
Yeah, that's true. And that particular
so it makes sense that like everybody in crypto, right, is going to, and like I'm making a game, right, Emergence on the Tezos blockchain that is based in crypto. And it's one of the discussions we're having. We're about to go to a sale of our cards for our game. And well, if we charge the same price in Tezos that we were going to charge, last year, we're getting a quarter of the price in dollars. But that's, the Tezos community only has so much Tez. So it's a huge problem. And it makes perfect sense that Coinbase would have to lay off people. So one of the problems in America in 2022 is that in some sense we're really spoiled by our expectation that like we shouldn't have to deal with shortages, that we shouldn't have to deal with substitution of consumption. And so our demand is very inelastic in many ways, much more so than before. We're also overregulated compared to what we used to be, right? We're told what we have to do in so many ways. The rules are set of what we must do. And so like 100, 200 years ago, right? Like if a lot of your audience is farmers, like farmers would learn, okay, if this is too expensive right now, what do I do instead? If this, if there's more demand for this crop instead of this crop, I'm going to adjust what I do. They were business people who were used to the idea that everything has prices, right? And you have to like adjust what you're doing. And you don't just get to eat whatever it is you're used to eating when different prices go up and down, because we have a problem in Ukraine where there's a grain problem, and now a lot of supply got disrupted, and all these prices are changing, and diesel got expensive, and so you have to buy more local because the transportation costs went up, and all of these problems. But that's sometimes it's temporary, because I'm not going to move for a temporary change in the price of gas for a few months, almost no matter how big it is. But if this happens for years, well, maybe my house in the suburb doesn't make sense anymore. Right? Maybe I have to figure out something else. Maybe I have to work from home. Maybe I have to move to one of these cities that's like kind of run down, but has walkable areas where I can live and go to the grocery store, and I can find another job because there's actually plenty of demand for labor in various ways, right? Or maybe I can repurpose some of these office buildings that are now vacant to be new apartments, so they can like, again, be in the business district and you can walk to work. There's a lot of things you can do in time, right? You can figure out how to substitute different consumption patterns and make do with less goods than you would expect with the same income endowment.
Where do you mentioned the labor shortage. Where do you think that came from, and why did it come on
I think it came from
suddenly? We
paid a lot of people not to work because of COVID conditions and the desire to be politically in a good place during those COVID conditions, because every politician wants to be popular, so we threw money at people. And a lot of people no longer had to work. I don't know to the extent crypto had anything to do with it, but like among people I know, it had a lot to do with it. And it was a potentially significant amount of money. It was like technically paper wealth there. And in general, like stocks were up, real estate was up, so like everybody's feeling wealthy. And work sort of is much less appealing and doesn't feel like it's necessary. And also, I think there's a thing that's being underappreciated, which is that especially young people, but also people in general, have stopped believing in the future in the same way they used to. They don't feel it as real. They like the feeling that climate change is going to kill everybody, and that the world isn't going to exist in 20, 30 years. Like a lot of people, especially young people, like kind of have in their brains, even if they don't really have a causal mechanism whereby that could actually happen. Right? It's a real problem, but like the chance of this kind of scenario is vanishingly small. But like if you have this just emotional felt sense that there is no future, right? Like you're never going to be able to afford a family. You're not going to have kids. Like there's nothing to look forward to. Well, then why shouldn't I sit at home and play Xbox? Like what's the downside if I don't develop my career?
I think what you're saying is real. My executive producer, Ben Anderson, is a really neat guy. He dropped out of college, started up a company, has been, prolifically pushing forward in his scientific career. But one of the things that he does with kids that are his counterpart, which would have just graduated this fall if he had stayed in school, is ask him, hey, what are you excited about in the future? And he is like running at about 100%, that everybody he has asked that's his age is like, nothing. I think unionization is increasing, or like they have very few things. There's nothing about families, nothing about the potential of jobs and the opportunity that middle management is going to pull them up.
Things, right? They've been raised on this culture
opportunities
where they're told that everything is terrible. There are all of these social problems that are so bad, and they should be so worried about these things. And they should be worried about like various problems in their worlds and their experiences. And they're not told, and they don't have this experience, this felt social culture, that what matters is their future and their financial future and their careers and their future families and, all of these things. And so a person who is approached in that way, yeah, they're not going to be very excited to go out into this world that's like so terrible in so many ways, and then take a terrible job, right? Because like most of the jobs you can get are not the jobs you want. And like I had that problem too, right? Like when I was starting out after college, like I had the great fortune to have been playing games for a living and earning enough money to keep doing that. It wasn't enough to raise a family or anything, but it was enough to like be a kid in his 20s and have a lot of fun and develop some actually turns out to be valuable skills. 2001.
And when did you graduate?
Yeah, and so in terms of like what can I do
almost exactly the
in
same.
a regular job, right? I wasn't excited about anything either. I just happened to have a great skill that turned out to be good enough that let me go down these other roads and develop these unique places. But for a while, smart people like in the 2000s would ask me, what should I do to make money? I would say, well, if you don't have anything great going on, you can always just play poker. Like it's not that hard. Like that's not a society solution, right, at all. Like they have to be willing to go out there and get excited by something, or like just decide to toil at something for a long time, work your way up, and it's the revolution of rising expectations, right? We've been taught that like humans don't deserve that; they're too good for that. Life needs to be better than that, and like that's a great aspiration, but it leads to people not wanting to enter the labor force and have those crappy jobs. I don't blame them one bit. I don't blame these kids at all. I think that they are right.
Yeah.
That's a crappy way to be. Right?
When I was in diplomacy school, I had this professor who was from China, and he used to lament. He used to say, oh, man, if I had only stayed in China, all of the people that I went to school with that had those crappy jobs for 20 years are now at the top of the party. And if I had just stayed there. And so his advice to me was, you should do the same thing. And I remember when I was in corporate America and I'm sitting there, watching the fact that like for a while there, middle management just didn't move. And I think this was true in a lot of companies. And then when COVID happened, middle management said, hey, we've got lots of cash. Look at our stock portfolio. We're jumping out. And now the people that were in corporate America with me, they aren't just moving up one level or two levels. You're watching people jump 3 levels, sometimes 4 levels. And I actually think the most underreported part of the supply chain crisis is that most people don't realize that it's not an org chart doesn't make you competent at your job. When you move up in levels, typically it's because you have the networks and the relationships and you understand how to fix things when they get broken and who actually you can trust and how do you make things work. And when middle management all left, the succession planning wasn't there. And so you moved people up that it's going to take them 5 years, 10 years to get caught up with that level of knowledge. They will eventually. But I think that is a major contributor to the supply chain problem was that, we had middle management capped for too long, it exploded, and
they
now we're
weren't
trying
training
to
the next generation the same way. I mean, look at all of our leaders and politicians, right? They're all super old. Nobody's letting go. We're not transitioning. And
that's exactly right. Speaker of the House, president, like they're so old, you cannot possibly imagine that these are people that are waking up
Trump
every
and
day,
Biden with an
curious about the world, willing to
two.
try new
Quite
things.
possibly,
Like
it's ridiculous. So the key is also that it turns out that like I did a sequence called Immoral Mazes, which I'm hoping to someday turn into a book. And like it points out that like being in these middle management positions, like dedicating yourself to these companies, kind of put yourself in a life that you don't really want. Like you can work your way up, you can get the brass ring and the gold watch and make a bunch of money. But is that really what you want to do with your life? Right? Do you want to have to live in that environment and adapt yourself to that environment over that time? And I reached the conclusion, basically you don't. Right? Like you don't want to try and like, you know, the inner ring and all that. Right? You don't want any part of playing these games where people are checking.
Well, because the only way to get to the inner ring is to give up things that you know, there's no chance of getting back, right? If you really want to get in there, you don't get to watch your 1-year-old learn to walk. You don't get to be around for all of the things that that make life enriched. You have to give them up in order to be a part of that corporate America, and there's no going back with time, and that's something that's hard for young people to grapple with.
So it's again, they're not wrong, right? Like these people have been given this kind of crappy deal for 10,000 years in various forms, and it's been slowly getting less crappy in general in many ways. I think what happened was people's expectations of how crappy it should be, you know, were moving faster than the reality, and also in some ways, like things stopped getting better. Then, like certainly at the same pace, right? We had a rapid improvement until some point in the late 20th century, and then we had, you know, some form of a great stagnation, where things really weren't improving as much, and where like we're just giving young people a relatively raw deal, and they're just not willing to take it the way people used to. And you know, in some ways things would be easier if they were willing to take it, and they'd kind of turn out all right. But also, the deal is really crappy, and I don't really blame them for not taking it.
But there's a real danger in a culture to having your middle class young people believe that the world isn't getting better. You know, one of the best books I ever read about social movements was The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. And he made the observation that when you have these mass movements, these big political will that gets generated, it's not done by people that are all the way at the bottom. They don't have the time or the energy or the resources or anything to make upheaval. And it's not the people at the top, obviously, because they're at the top. They don't want to risk it. It's the people in the middle that believe like, hey, if I shake this snow globe up, then there's a chance I might be on the top.
You don't get a
but
revolution,
since things aren't getting better anyway, why not do it?
Terrible.
And so the thing that you're
you
describing is...
because everyone's life used to be terrible, and now it's less terrible, and then it got slightly more terrible, and they're not putting up with that. Right? You make it better, and then slightly worse, or like not better enough, and then you're in trouble.
Well, and that's like, I mean, you look at China, for example, the professor I was talking about earlier, he used to talk about how one of the ways that the Chinese people knew that their lives were getting better was they went from eating meat maybe 3 or 4 times a year to eating it once a month, to eating it once a week, to then having it available to you every single day. And so when you talk about the things that could prompt some sort of revolution in China, it's likely not over some sort of civil issue. It's over, am I no longer able to, you know, have meat every single day of the week? And I think that that's emblematic of exactly what you're saying, right? It's that standard of living has gone up, and if it starts to go down, it doesn't have to get to the fact that we're all going to be coal miners again.
Standards of living
it just has to be
decline.
not as good as it once was.
People will not be having it, and luckily we live in a democracy, and therefore, like, they'll try to express themselves by voting for the other party, depending on who happens to be in charge at the time, and hopefully we can turn it around. But yeah, no, we are not built to survive negative growth or like reduced real life experience in ways people feel. And so we're instead sacrificing other things to try and maintain that. But that's unsustainable. Like a lot of it is we're just sacrificing children. Right? Like people are just not having the kids they want to have because they look at the lifestyle they'd have if they had those kids, the way our society is structured, and they say, I can't do it. The problem being biology is what it is.
Yeah, or they wait
too
so long, right? They
they would have wanted to have 2, 3, 4 kids, but by the time they get around to having them, they get 1, they get 2, and that's all they can get.
So, what do you think is going to happen with Russia and Ukraine? Is Putin a madman that can't be stopped and will just keep going if we don't stop him?
So,
what do you think here?
Words like bad are just like not helpful. in figuring out what's going on, I would say Putin really, really believes Ukraine belongs to Mother Russia and is part of Mother Russia. And if nobody stops him from doing so, he will take over Ukraine. So, we want to strongly consider doing that. And if he was allowed to take over Ukraine, I think there's a large probability that he will not stop there. I think that he wants everything that has ever belonged to Russia and everything that's ever been claimed by Russia belongs to Russia in his mind. And and having taken Ukraine, he will feel like he now has a mandate to, revive the Russian Rus in all of its glory in some form. And I think he's laid this out to us very carefully. He's talked about like his grudges with Lithuania and Sweden and Poland over things that happened centuries ago, and how the breakup of the Soviet Union was a colossal tragedy. And I don't see any reason to expect him to stop unless he believes that he's being opposed by sufficient force. And so, yeah, I don't see what the alternative is in that sense.
Interesting. The thing that's been the biggest struggle for me, and actually, if COVID didn't tell you that the government of the United States will, propagandize its people, then I think the Ukraine-Russia situation should, in the sense that we, for some reason, completely accepted that YouTube and all the other channels would take off all of the communication that came out of Russia. So if you used to say, hey, every once in a while I turn on Russia Today and I see what they're saying, you just can't get that information anymore. And when I started seeing that, like, I have no idea what his intents are. I think there has been, any bloodshed among civilians is a terrible thing. But I am deeply suspicious of a culture that allows itself to be cut off from information from the other side when they will freely give you at least their perspective.
No matter how hard you think we're cutting off
How
information,
do
Russia
you
is
feel
cutting it off
about
so much harder.
the way we handle
right?
that?
Like they are like outright just cutting off anything that disagrees with them. They're arresting people for expressing opposing views, right? Like this is not a subtle thing. Second of all, we're not cutting it off that hard, right? We may be cutting it, taking it down from YouTube. But if you want to see what Russia Today is saying, it's not that difficult. I see extensive clips on Twitter of what they're saying on Russian television all the time. Pretty scary stuff. Plenty of Russians are expressing what they see coming out of Russia, what they say is going out of Russia. The official Russian propaganda lines are absolutely shared with the West. We know what they are. Yes, I very much wish we weren't censoring. I think it's a very, very bad sign that we're censoring how much we are. However, we also have a history of not being so great with this First Amendment thing. Everyone remembers World War I, for example, right? Like in Woodrow Wilson. This is not a new problem, but basically, we actively just suspended freedom of the press.
I couldn't tell you what you mean by that. Tell me more.
We arrested people who were hanging out
absent
who were
that now.
leaflets in the street. Right? We were just like, no, we're not doing this.
Okay.
And like our World War II propaganda was, pure propaganda. I mean, for good cause, I believe, but was what it was. We're not none of this is new. And I feel like we're actually in a pretty good epistemic environment in that sense because we have Twitter and we have these other information sources that are so much richer than we had in the past. So I feel so much better informed, despite all the restrictions, than I would in a fully open 1993 or whatever it would be. But when I was watching the Gulf War, I didn't feel like anyone was restricting information, but I also felt like I had to rely upon the New York Times and CNN for my information on what was happening in a way I don't now. And so effectively, the propaganda was so much more effective at selecting for what I was going to see about what was going on in the Iraq War than it is for this war, right? And so now I actually do see alternate perspectives. I do see alternate opinions. But also, like, you can look at often, like, you ask yourself, okay, what is the other side saying, right? And that's the best thing they could choose to say from their perspective. Why did they choose to say that? And so you see the Russians making, claims that don't make any sense on a physical basis, that are obvious, that are obvious lies. And in fact, part of my model of Putin is that, and Russia, is that they are doing the thing where they state obvious lies as a show of strength, to show that they are willing to say obvious lies, right? They know that you don't believe, and it's intentional in many cases. This explains some obvious, otherwise stupid mistakes by someone who used to head the KGB, right? But it makes perfect sense if you think that he is trying to show his strength. He believes this represents the power of Russia. If you can't even lie, if you're not willing to lie, you must be weak, right? In some sense. And so, But the Russian stories just don't hold up. The Russian stories make no sense. And I do think we're getting enough of them to tell that. It doesn't mean that our story is real, right? It doesn't mean that their story has no truth. Surely they occasionally tell the truth. Every good liar does. And we are not being fully honest, but we have a relatively open information environment. And I feel like I wrote a series of posts on Ukraine. Right? I think I wrote 11 of them or something back when it was starting out. And I thought I had a pretty good idea of what was going on. I felt like I had a pretty confident. I knew where the battle lines were, what the strategies were, what the balance of power was, what was happening, what was And I was out in front in that sense of, no, Ukraine's doing much better than it looks like Ukraine is doing at this point. And meticulous, I was ahead of the curve on that and so on. And then after they withdrew from the Kiev front and things were settling in for the Donbass fight, I said, okay, this is not really useful for me to be parsing this information anymore. Right? I'm not going to learn things that actually inform my life and my decisions or those of my readers. I should focus on something else. And so I haven't been following as much. I don't know the extent to which the Russian progress in that area is real or is being compensated for by gains in other areas by the Ukrainians. I haven't looked at my lists of sources for weeks, basically. But I do feel like these problems are solvable because of this, Scott Alexander called it bounded distrust. This idea that everybody has rules for sort of in what ways they are and aren't willing to misrepresent reality, in what ways they're willing to lie, and what ways they insist on telling the truth. And so you assume that within their rules, they're doing the best they can to support their positions, and you work out what's really going on. And if you're good at this, you can actually tell a lot of the times most of the situation. And I think what's some of the most unclear stuff is what's happening to the Russian economy. Right? Is Russia's war effort sustainable? And that's a place where I feel like I would need to investigate much more carefully than I have been to have a strong opinion.
Well, this has been an entirely fascinating conversation. For my last question, I'd be interested. Let's go totally far afield. What was the best fiction book you've read recently?
Probably Hyperion. It's a science fiction novel. But I have unfortunately been so focused on web reading and blogs and a handful of nonfiction books. I read Talent by Tyler Cowen, which is a nonfiction book, very recently. I thought that was excellent. I wrote a long review of it.
Yeah, I was reading your commentary back and forth with about the commentary on the Rationalist Society or the community, and kind of that was an interesting thing. It's worth checking out on your blog. I am reading right now The Count of Monte Cristo. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but that, holy cow, that has to be the most wild. That's a book I consider to be one of a once in a lifetime book. You are only going to get a chance to have this be your full experience one time.
Well, yes, you sometimes get only
it is an amazing book.
Once, but you're trying to read it a lot more than once, right? People the famous quote: "You don't read Ulysses, you reread Ulysses." And so, my personal book of this type that I come back the most times to is the Illuminatus trilogy, actually by Robert Anton Wilson. And I've read that a large number of times, and I got a different thing out of it each time that I've read it.
Interesting. I'm certain you would get a lot more out of a second read of The Count of Monte Cristo because there's so much hidden. Even if you know the general story, as it unfolds, you just can't even believe that this thing happened and then this thing happened. And it's so anyway, we read it for a book club right now that we're in called the As the Crow Flies book club, and it is the best book we've read so far in there, I think. All right. Well, Zvi, this has been a fantastic conversation. If people wanted to read your blog or find out more about what you do, where would they find you?
Or Substack.com. So I have moved my primary, I consider it, over to Substack, but for SEO reasons and because a lot of people are used to going to WordPress, I cross-post everything to WordPress anyway. So everything gets two versions. Just slightly annoying when I have to edit something, but otherwise it's fine. Technically there's 3 versions because Less Wrong auto-posts everything as well. But you can find my stuff there, or you can find links to most of it. I'm Zvi on Twitter as well.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. And if you will ever come back on, I'll have you. This was a blast.